Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth Spivak and Mike Burke talk about how overly positive yet counterproductive feedback might disproportionately impact minority students. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Helping us trying to make sense of the topsy-turvy dystopian reality that we find ourselves in academia and in large parts of legacy and social media too, I believe. So near the end of the last podcast that we recorded, might not be the last one that goes out, but near the end of the last podcast we recorded, I raised an anecdote that actually came from another academic, an American Hispanic friend of mine. And he had observed that when he was in university and in school, he had been told constantly that racism was such, he felt that he'd been bombarded with this message that racism was such that it would be highly unlikely, even if he works really hard and he's really smart, that he would succeed. And that led him to feel like it wasn't worth trying. Which in turn he felt explained why he got involved with gang violence for a while before getting back on the straight and narrow and becoming an academic. And when he was recounting his stories at university in America, he told me that he felt that he was being given a very easy time by the teachers and that he compared his work to other students, white students, and he thought that their work was often better than his, but he was nevertheless being awarded higher grades than they were. And he didn't like that. He felt that he was being kind of shortchanged by the institution. He felt that it was unfair to the white students. And he felt that it was kind of mollycoddling Hispanic and black students. And he, regarded that as a kind of racism. Not the kind of KKK kind of racism, but a kind of racism, a kind of soft bigotry of low expectations, I think it's often put. But again, he was also pointing out, look, I'm a sample size of one. Maybe I misunderstood things. Maybe I didn't misunderstand things. Maybe it was just this college or just these few teachers. Is it an example of a wider problem? And again, anecdotally, before we look at the evidence, if I had to put money down on one side or the other, I would say I think it probably is an example of a bigger problem. That racism is endemic within Western institutions such as universities, but not the kind of racism that one would imagine. Not the kind of racism that we're supposed to accept is everywhere, that there's this kind of implicit bias against black people, that we think that they're morally or intellectually inferior or anything like that. That actually it's something that's a bit more subtle and pernicious. So we're going to have a look at it. So the paper we are looking at is by Kent D. Harber and Stephanie Reeves. So that's Rutgers University at Newark and Ohio State University. James L. Gorman, Christian H. Williams, Jennifer Malin, and James Pennebaker. Wow. So that's University of Texas at Austin and another one at Rutgers University at Newark. And that's quite incredible already. That they're academics, all of them, 4 of them on a paper, and their names can be easily pronounced.
Actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people.
Oh, 6. Sorry, I just read 4 entries.
And
that's right.
Yeah, and Harber, actually, the first author, has actually been a co-author on several papers in this same vein.
Okay.
And he kind of collaborated. James Pennebaker is sort of the person to go to for language analysis.
Okay.
So, so Pennebaker would be the kind of, the language analysis person, and Harber would be sort of the social psychologist who's, again, been involved in several studies on the nature of this conflicted language of interracial feedback. So,
right. So let's, before we dive right into the paper, let's, if the moral orthodoxy was correct, that there is this bias against black people, then on feedback for papers, what we would expect would be that white students are afforded higher grades, and are given more positive feedback. And we would expect that black students, as well as probably Hispanics and Asians, because they're all chucked in with that, aren't they? At varying levels of oppression, but they're certainly
Well,
all in there.
actually, Asians perhaps not, right? Because that would be the modern minority stereotype stuff where they're expected to outperform.
Maybe. There are many ways of kind of explaining around that. Like
Yes,
some say that Asians are really good at acting out whiteness.
yes.
Which is just nonsense, because actually if you look at the cultural patterns of how they behave, which I've actually done, I've written book chapters on this, the way in which Japanese and Chinese people generally approach academic pursuits is very different to the way in which generally most Anglo-Saxon people would. So they're not acting out whiteness, they're actually doing something that's quite authentic to their cultural contexts. Anyway, but certainly white versus black students, we would expect that white students had inflated grades and better feedback, and that black students would get lower grades and more critical feedback, critical in the negative sense feedback, if the moral orthodoxy that there is this kind of anti-black implicit bias was to hold. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah. I mean, that's what, we would, again, not knowing anything else except what's in the air that we breathe right now, that's what
Right.
we would predict, right?
Yeah, and I
um,
would go. I would go even further. That if you were to challenge that notion, even by saying, "Look, perhaps it's not true,"
mm,
let alone doing a study and saying, "Look, we've tested this and said it's not true." I think in many academic contexts in the US and the UK, simply by challenging it and saying, "Look, maybe this isn't true. Maybe we should test it," or "I maybe it is true, but I don't think it's true. I don't think it's likely that it's true." That would be more than enough to get you in quite a lot of trouble in
yeah.
some
And
places.
again, related, apropos to our previously recorded podcast,
Hmm.
right?
Right. So being,
Where,
it's not just being able to engage with reality will get you in trouble, but so can being willing to engage with
yeah.
reality. Can also get you in trouble quite unbelievably in the institutions of learning that are tasked with engaging with reality and finding out what's going on in the world. Okay, so I think we've covered what the paper's about. Let's
Well,
now jump in.
yeah. So yeah, the researchers were interested in this case, what they're calling the natural language of feedback on student papers. And again, there have been many studies, so I don't want to suggest that this is the only one. There's quite a lengthy history, but this particular research design is so complicated, has so many steps, that the researchers actually included a helpful little appendix that lists what the participants did. I'm sure that was asked for by the editors. So go ahead.
As a quick pause, because I have to do this because you do this all the time. There are times when I'm talking or there's a certain set of concept and Elizabeth's eyes just glaze over.
Yes,
And this is an
you're going
example
to
of a
glaze
time
over right
when
now.
my eyes just glaze over all the statistics and method.
Yes. Well, I'm not going to do statistics yet. I am going to do
Okay.
statistics, but not right now. So I just want to kind of go through what participants did when they came to, how this study was designed, so that, because that will make the results are somewhat complicated by condition and, caveats and special trichotomized variables and blah, blah, blah. So participants were college students in Texas, and they were, almost all white. So other non-white participants were still went through the study, but they were eliminated from the analysis. So it was only white participants who were in the actual study. As published. So participants came to a lab and they were told that they were going to to evaluate something called feedback forward, which is this way to give supposedly new way to give feedback to writers that would be confidential and sort of like a paper trading kind of thing, like you're giving feedback to other students the way that you might in a paper trading thing in a class or something like that. But this is going to be online. So they had a little sort of meet your writer kind of summary. So they learned that, among other things, so it's like a little supposedly a little biographical sketch written by the writer to provide the reader with some information. So it was gender and race, and other kinds of sort of banalities. Okay, and then there was instructions about how to evaluate the essay. So they actually were presented with what was known to be a poorly written essay. So all the essays, there are two different versions: a global warming essay and a parental control essay, and they were both poorly written, evaluated by instructors as essentially C- essays. Okay, so these are essays that would,
barely passing.
right, exactly. And so they evaluate the essay, learning how to use the program, blah, blah, blah. Then they answer some questions that supposedly the essay writer asked. Things like, what did you think of my essay? What did you think of my intro, my conclusion, anything else? What do you see as the biggest strengths and weaknesses? My major, I'm thinking about changing my major to journalism. What do you think? So, different ways of asking what you think.
That's important though, isn't it? Because that's, changing my major to journalism implies that, the feedback would be, I want to go on and have a professional
Relevant.
writing career, right?
Exactly.
So it's quite relevant. Yeah. And they identify
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
Um, Questions about the mechanics and the content of the essay. And then questions like, again, should I submit the essay to a school paper? Do you think I'm a good writer? So it's like all these different, kinds of things. Then they hit the button to send their feedback to, through the system to the writer. Okay. After that, then there was just sort of an evaluation of the process. So again, this is all sort of under the guise of, oh, this is going to be something new that we might use, a tool we might use. So they asked, like, how did you, feel about doing the exercise? One of the questions, which becomes very important in the analyses, is I was comfortable giving feedback. So this becomes very important. Okay, it's one question. It's on a 7-point scale. 1, not at all comfortable. 7, very comfortable. Okay. Then there's like demographic questions, typical things that people answer, and then they were thanked and dismissed from the study. So the researchers, again, this is in the past, Harber has done some research where they just asked, including professors, by the way, other kinds of teachers. They've done this at all, at all different levels of teaching. Just asked for grades and minimal kinds of feedback. The reason they got James Pennebaker involved is because he is his field, his specialty
His thing.
is the analysis of language and word use and that kind of stuff. So they actually this time wanted to analyze using James Pennebaker's expertise, the kinds of feedback and the words that were used and the style of language that was used in giving this feedback. So does that make sense? Have I
It does.
covered
So
the
no,
basics?
I think that makes sense. So we've got on the one hand, we're looking at people's responses and how comfortable they feel, but then we're also looking at the language of the feedback. So how are the sentences put together? What kind of words are being used? And then how do we analyze that? And how do we find out what that means? Beneath the simple words themselves, what the actual word pattern means, what it shows in the I don't know, the thoughts and feelings of the people giving the feedback. Fair enough.
Right. Yeah. what it might reveal. Yeah.
What it might reveal, yeah.
So basically, what they did was that comfort question, how comfortable were you giving feedback? They trichotomized that variable, low, medium, and high. So they took a 7-point scale and grouped it into 3 groups, low, medium, and high. Okay. And then they analyzed the most of the data based on that comfort level. Now, do I think that this was planned? I am mighty suspicious that it was not planned. It's one question. Look, I mean, I'm not saying that it couldn't be, okay, but I would say it's somewhat unusual to analyze data based on one question. So I mean, the other issue, the other sort of, I mean, the results are fairly robust, and so, but I just feel the need, I feel the need to sort of frame them in this. Yeah, it's robust, but there's, I find this somewhat suspicious that they used a question and they somehow analyzed all of the data within this, not a 7-point scale, but they now made it a 3-point categorical thing instead of a continuous variable. The other thing is there's about 15 to 17 people per group because there were so many conditions in the study. They say, oh, that's somewhat less than the 20 we would have liked per condition. I mean, standard would be we want 30 per condition. So I'm a little, it's like they analyzed the living shit out of this data. I mean, they analyzed it every which way but sideways. And to have such small sample sizes and just keep hammering at it, again, sort of like I mentioned last week, if you and I tried to publish this study, we probably couldn't get away with it. But it's Harber and Pennebaker, so there you go, kind of thing. So it got a second read. I think it's valuable information, and I don't, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have gotten published. I guess I'm more saying that more studies, maybe that are slightly flawed, should get a second look, because, it's hard to design the perfect study, and especially one this complicated. So I just want to go through before we talk about the sort of summarize. So low level of comfort was associated with differential feedback on almost every level. So for example, open-ended comments, low level of comfort more was associated with more critical evaluations of essays supposedly written by white participants. Mm-hmm. Low level of comfort was associated with more positive feedback for Black writers. Style of comment, low level of comfort, more complex feedback for white writers. High level of comfort, more complex feedback for Black writers. Emotional tone, low level of comfort, more positive emotional words for Black writers. Again, remember, these weren't really Black or white writers. It was fake, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Linguistic style matching. So this is the idea that when we are interacting with someone that we like, or we're trying to get them to like us, we tend to match their style of speaking and even use their, if they're using a lot of slang, we use some slang. If they, we kind of get in the groove with their language. Linguistic style matching was more common with supposedly Black writers. Lenient language, more with Black writers at low levels of comfort. Copy edits, generally more positive for Black writers. So, I mean, there's a lot more results, in here, but that's sort of the summary. So basically, at low levels of comfort, participants were more critical of supposedly white writers, but at low levels of comfort, they gave more positive feedback to Black writers, more lenient language with Black writers. So what the authors are saying here is, wait a minute, you gave them positive, open-ended comments that were less complex overall, that included, so they included more positive emotion words, more linguistic style matching, but they were less productive comments. So they were less complex. So more positive, the valence was more positive, the style of language was more positive, but they were less constructive in their criticism. Higher grades, more encouragement to change your major, more agreement that the essay was good. One of the things they had was, oh, my teaching assistant told me I'd done a good job. Do you agree with them? Black writers, the participant was more likely to tend to agree with the TA. So what we have here is not what you framed at the beginning, right? Which is that, Blacks are getting, negative feedback and they're getting discouraged in the school system, and maybe that, maybe that's why they're disengaged or whatever. In fact, we're finding that they're getting more positive feedback, and the authors are quite critical of the people giving feedback and saying, well, you're being nice, but you're being nice in an unhelpful way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but at issue here, and they admittedly do weave this in gently, but it's in there, that the white evaluators of Black writers are concerned about their egalitarian, looking like they're racist, basically. There's, as evidenced supposedly by this comfort question. Now, I don't know that the comfort question gets at that, but there's a hint there, I guess.
Interesting. So the experiences of my friend and colleague would seem to be borne out really by the study, right? It would seem to
Yes, and again, there's a
suggest he
series
was
of
right.
studies suggesting this same kind of this pattern. But what? So I flagged something. I want to find it here. So because I was thinking, well, duh. So here, so they write, the Black writer received more positive copy edits, but only among participants whose egalitarian self-images may have been threatened. And I was thinking to myself, well, now in today's time, when are our egalitarian self-images not threatened? I mean, we're walking around as, if we are if we're not a member of today's oppressed group, right? Then our egalitarian self-images are being threatened like pretty much all the time, right?
Right.
So, and then the other thing that they point out, that they say like, wait a minute. They say little is known about the learning liabilities of an overly lenient feedback style. And I wrote, oh, I think we know. Because look, I think this has never been more salient than post-COVID,
Mm-hmm.
that and what's happened, like I just was reading a couple of weeks ago that high school graduates, and this is locally in Massachusetts, which is supposedly this, hotbed of of academics, are graduating reading at around the 5th grade level.
Yeah,
And
it's
so I think, I think we do know the product of a lenient grading system where parents will fight where, every possible grade where teachers do not feel comfortable or are punished for giving low grades, where we have where turning in late, there's no consequences for turning in late. We just, I mean, I've actually had students, I actually had a student say to me not that long ago, well, how am I going to pass this class if you're actually going to grade my homework? So the assumption was I turn something in no matter what, and I get points for that. And so that's how I passed the class, for just simply turning in a piece of paper with my name on it. How am I going to pass this class if you are actually going to grade my homework? So I think we do know. And so it's probably ubiquitous and maybe worse for some people, for
So
some groups, depending on the
so
level of comfort.
I've got a really good anecdote for this, that you'll like. When I was choosing my son's elementary school, they showed the results of their elementary school 10-year-olds, and Japanese 10-year-olds, and they showed that their English reading proficiency at 10 was above the national average in America. And they were really proud of that, and all of the other mums and dads were like, "Whoa, sugoi!" Sugoi means amazing. It's like, "Oh, isn't that great?" And all the rest of it. And I was like, "No, that doesn't tell you what you think it tells you. It really doesn't." um,
You
it's kind of
perhaps should not
da-
be
da-
so.
damning by faint praise. I don't know, but
Yes,
yeah,
yes, yes, yes.
yeah.
So I think, and I would hazard a guess. So this article was published in 2019, which is not that long ago. And again, there've been several studies. I would hazard a guess that, if repeated now, that because that it would be uh, more ubiquitous. That
Hmm.
there would be more discomfort in general with giving any kind of feedback to any learner. Now, one thing I will say is that over and over again, and I kind of already said this, that there were only significant differences in the kinds of feedback at low levels of comfort. And you would expect most actual teachers to be much more comfortable giving feedback. And so at medium and high levels of comfort giving feedback, there were no significant differences in most of these categories. And you would expect most teachers to be fairly comfortable giving feedback. I'm not sure that would be true today. Only 5 years, well, this was published in 2019. I would say most likely the data was collected a couple of years earlier than that. It would take a couple of years, to get through the analysis. I mean, this is pretty heavy analysis and writing up and everything like that. So let's say that the data was, collected even, over like approximately 8 years ago. 8 years ago in education is like a century, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, this is huge in this kind of topic. For many topics, perhaps not, but for this one, I think that, you know, embarking on a replication of this would be quite enlightening.
I mean, I when I started my last university, and they recruit academics on a yearly basis. When I started my last university, um, the intake of teachers that I was in was very, very, very much, very, very different to the intake of teachers that followed us. And as the years have gone on, at that university, I've just seen more and more critical social justice advocates coming in, and traditional liberals like me being pushed out. And it's gone from, when I joined that university, it was just such a great place to work, like so many really nice people, and there's still good people there, but it's, these people just poison the atmosphere. And it's gone from being somewhere that was great to work when I joined, to, I have it on good authority from my friends who still work there, to just kind of a hellhole, where you're just constantly walking on eggshells everywhere. So, the atmosphere in education has changed, in
Well,
8
and we
years.
were
It's night
just,
and day.
yeah. We just did ILV just had a lab with, I can't remember Eli's last name. His
Steel.
documentary,
Steel.
Eli
Is
Steele,
this the steel? Yeah.
his documentary Killing America. The centerpiece of that documentary is in the California school district. They're getting rid of the advanced placement classes because because they were deemed racist, because not enough minority students were participating in them district wide. So it wasn't just in one high school or one area. So I mean, this is what we've wrought, right? That's why I said, like, oh, I think we know what the long-term effects are of, lenient grading and uh, overly positive feedback for mediocre work and stuff. We know that some kids, but fewer of them, will still excel. They will, for whatever reason, whether that, and instead of looking at the reasons why some kids still are still excelling, instead of looking at that, then we just have to dumb everything down so that we just say, oh well, they'll succeed regardless, so we don't have to take care of them. Let's just lower the bar for everybody else.
And we also know what the consequences of giving lots of negative feedback are to the Japanese, by the way, because well, Japan has alongside Taiwan, has the highest IQ of any country, highest average IQ of any country. And the Japanese education system is absolutely chock full of tests and grading. And then on top of that, they have a cultural practice called Hansei, which is a kind of a reflective session. Whereas in America, a reflective session would be focus on your positives and all that. It's completely the opposite. It's you focus and reflect upon your negative aspects in your behavior and your motivation and your academic abilities, and you bring them to the fore and you work on fixing them. And there are all kinds of problems with the educational system over here. Like, I mean, it's good at science and math and things like that. It's terrible at anything that's creative. But science and math are quite important.
Yeah.
Turns out. Um, but it works. The education system for these kinds of things works, and there are some schools in America that are trying to take the Japanese approach right now, and it's working with them too. So yeah, we know that negative feedback is important.
Mm-hmm.
How would it not be? Because look, I can write a fairly good paper now, right? Probably not a statistical one, but on other subjects, right? But if you were asked me to do that when I was 18, I wouldn't have been able to. I would be able to write you a paper,
Right.
but it would have been crap. And if I hadn't have got feedback telling me it was crap and explaining why it was crap, then I wouldn't have been able to grow. Or maybe I would have been able to, but it would have been much harder because it would only be me analyzing me, and I wouldn't have had the help of someone who has benefited from them analyzing them and other people correcting them too. So it's obvious, really. I mean, this kind of one of the things that you don't really need stats. It's like, so it should be the null hypothesis, right? We should assume this is true until somebody can disprove it. But yes, I mean, it's utterly astonishing. This idea that we're going to get rid of high placement tests because the fact that there aren't as many black people in there shows that the cause of that is racism.
Right. And again, there's, it's like instead of looking at, in a Will Riley fashion, let's look at what's really behind this
Happening, yeah.
and what might actually affect change. We'll just get rid of it. Now, here locally where I am, they're thinking about getting rid of the exam that kids have to take. So they have to pass what's called, so the Massachusetts Commonwealth Achievement Test or something,
Hmm.
MCAS, MCAT. something like that. By the time they graduate, they have to pass at a certain level in order to have graduated from high school. So they can attend high school the entire time and not pass this test and not get their diploma. But they're trying to do away with that. They did away with it during the pandemic because I think partly because they didn't know how to give it during the pandemic. They weren't sure, there's a year or two there where they weren't sure how
Fair
to
enough.
give it. Yeah. And so, but now nobody, they don't want to, they don't, they're trying to get rid of it. And going back to, oh, well, the teachers know the best. Well, I think that, this study and, what we see happening if people are graduating at reading at the 5th grade level, I think we're not that I'm not suggesting that teachers are incompetent.
Oh, I
I'm
am.
suggesting, well, I'm sure that there are some, but as a whole, I don't think teachers are
No,
incompetent or uncaring or uninterested in doing a good job. I think that you know, especially in the modern era, they're under so much pressure to give all this positive reinforcement
y-
to that they've gotten distracted by critical race theory kinds of things. They're doing activities
yeah,
in classrooms that are not content related,
no.
and but that people they like doing them. So the kids are happy. I had fun today. I like my teacher, kinds of things that are not advancing reading, writing, science, math. And so I think that some of them think they're doing a good job by doing those. They genuinely do. I think others are feeling the pressure, and we are under so much pressure, even at the university level, to be mental health providers. That we are supposed to, that empathy above all else, unlimited deadline extensions, just again, the tyranny of low expectations, as you've said. And it isn't, I'm not suggesting it's just minority students, because it's most certainly not. It's across the board. But I do think that there's a special kind of fear of not extending those kinds of offers and positive reinforcement kind of things to minority students, that that's exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, so it's not only minority students, it remains a serious problem
No.
right across the broad board, but it's
Yes.
especially a problem for minority students, especially
Yes.
targeted at them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And one of the things the author brings out is when a minority student or any student who's gotten consistently good feedback um, for poor performance, okay, poor writing in this case, when they get accurate feedback, then they might feel attacked. And that may then stop the evaluator from ever doing that again, right?
right.
And so giving positive feedback, I mean, giving negative feedback when negative feedback is deserved may also be dangerous, because that student's history has been to get more positive feedback than they deserved.
Couple of observations I would make here as someone who's taught undergrads for best part of 10 years. When you're giving negative feedback, there are nice ways of giving negative feedback. Right? There are really positive ways of giving negative feedback that is just as critical, but you just use your kind of social
Well, you
skills and your
have to be
language
careful,
to kind
though.
of
I think I've told you this story before, but
okay.
a student a student came up to me and said, well, can I turn in my, paper late, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no. And, this is why I have my reasons. And, I've told other people, one of them is I've told other people no. And it would be unfair
Mhm.
to all of the people I've told no up until now to tell you yes. There's lots of good reasons, not letting things pile up till the end of the semester, blah, blah, blah. So I'm telling him no, refer to the syllabus, all that kind of stuff. So he comes the next day with his paper to give me. And I said, no, I explained to you, I'm not accepting this, late paper. And he said, yeah, but you said it with a smile.
For fuck's sake.
So his interpretation was that because there was a positive I was trying to make the interaction positive, right? I'm telling you no, but I don't want him to know that it's not like it's not just you. It's not because you're you. It's not because,
I
whatever.
don't hate
There's,
you.
I
Yeah.
don't hate you. There's all these reasons. I went over this at the beginning of the class, why there are these reasons, why I don't do this. These are low stakes assignments. You've missed one. That's okay. I dropped two, whatever. No, the answer is no. But because
Mhm.
I said it with a smile. So and this is kind of what this essay is saying too, or this paper is saying, is that, yes, there are nice ways of being critical, but if you are in this paper, they're saying, when you're too nice, the critical message just gets lost.
I'm just remembering one of the worst teachers I have ever come across at the university level, and quite how he was in a position that he could teach. But the fact that he's actually in the classroom shows how far educational standards had
Yeah,
slipped,
yeah,
even by the time he qualified. And the students the feedback, he would never give feedback face to face. The feedback would always be written. And his feedback would be something like, this sentence is awkward. And then, this is awkward. This is terrible. And that was his feedback. Nobody can do anything with that. I just wanted to point out
but
there are people who are like that.
now that we have in-text editing and that kind of thing, one of the things I find is that I spend hours on a student paper I would say I probably spend 90 minutes editing each student's paper. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know what a lot of times they'll just accept all the changes, and they don't make any. It's like, if you don't say something like, this is an awkward sentence, they will not actually pay any attention to revising the sentence. When you make the revisions and you give them too much feedback, that's not helpful either, because then they're not required to do anything.
There is a kind of sweet spot between,
Yeah, yeah,
from a methodological, between two negatives. It's kind of like Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. You don't want somebody to have no anger, because then they're going to be a complete coward.
right.
But you don't want them to be like a crazy hothead who's going to stab somebody for looking at them in the wrong way either. The sweet spot is, the virtue is found between two vices, right? Yeah.
So sometimes I will just write on it. I mean, sometimes there'll be a couple sentences and I'll just put an arrow and I'll write, huh? Like, that's beyond awkward. Like, I have no idea what you're saying here. You need to fix this. I can't fix it, huh?
So another thing I wanted to point out, and this is based in my knowledge of education as an academic field, is the extent to which it has corrupted the actual purpose of teaching, right? So, you probably don't think this way because you're a social psychologist. So it's like, from your point of view, when you get into a classroom, the purpose of your class is to teach these students something about social psychology, right? If you're a philosopher, it's the same. If you're in international relations, it's exactly the same thing. However, education has been corrupted in a way that no discipline, even social psychology, has not. Has. I mean, it's really, 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 really bad. To the point where, I mean, if you look at the big thing for academics and educators is critical thinking, right? Nobody knows what it means, but critical thinking, one of those great words.
It sounds
What do you
really
mean by
good.
critical? What do you mean by it? And more often than not, what they try and do is they say, okay, well, critical thinking, if we were to give a definition of critical thinking, we would probably say logic combined with an awareness of various psychological biases that can cause flawed conclusions. You can poke holes with that, but it would be something in that direction, right? In the academic literature, often people, and I'm thinking about probably the most famous thinker in critical thinking. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's gone, but anyway. But he said something like, critical thinking in the weak sense, and this is generally agreed with in academia, by the way, in in education, academia. Critical weak thinking is the weak sense, and all of that stuff that you and I have talked about is all terribly important and the rest of it. But by important, they mean, okay, lip service, right? But what is most important is critical thinking in the strong sense. And critical thinking in the strong sense, they say, is emancipatory reasoning aimed at basically realizing how oppression works in society, which is critical theory. So critical thinking takes the critical that most people naively understand it to be, which is what, we would try to formulate as a definition of critical thinking, and
It
it kind
sort
of
of
supplants
demotes
it with
that.
idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
demotes it. Well, no, not only demotes it, it just by paying lip service. Now we don't need to do anything about it because that's secondary, right? And what is
Right.
more important is awakening, if you like, to how education, power structures, and so on and so forth are oppressing kids. So when I did my master's degree back in 2011, something like that, in education, that was the consensus then,
Hmm.
right? I was failed on a critical thinking paper because I said that this is nonsense. These two objectives have conflicting epistemologies. One has a kind of an empiricist scientific epistemology, which would say open questions. Are we all being oppressed? Well, maybe. How do we go and figure that out, right? What is oppression? How do we quantify it? How do we test it? And we must be open to the answer being yes or no, or sometimes, or, a more kind of open mind empiricist kind of epistemology. Whereas this kind of assuming oppression is the case, and they outright say that, like, we assume oppression and now we just have to figure out how to awaken ourselves to it and thereby transform society. That's not an empiricist epistemology, right? And the two epistemologies are fundamentally at odds with each other. And by arguing that, I got failed in an essay. And so I had to rewrite the whole thing, paying lip service, to this nonsense. And then, I just wrote some ideological drivel, and for which I got like an A+, but it was struck down
Yeah.
to a C because I'd failed the first essay.
I have an example of that from this week at
Uh-huh.
my very institution. So we were asked to read an article, of course, about diversity for our meeting. And the article was from 2011. So again, like the dark ages, right, in terms of current, thinking. So, and supposedly students, like, I shouldn't say supposedly, they analyzed the data, and students had claimed that they would like to see more of themselves reflected in the authors and writings and readings and stuff that they did for the class. Okay. So more diversity in terms of the reading material and stuff. Now, when I pick something for my students to read, I am focused, as you were saying, like on this, sort of the traditional critical thinking kind of criteria. And I'm interested in whether students are actually going to read it. Okay. So if I pick a 20-page article with all kinds of statistics, I start to glaze over, like with you, right? It's like, and they're not good yet at finding, like, you can get through an article like that because you can
Yeah.
find the important part. You can figure out how, well, they're not there yet, right? So
Mhm.
I try to pick things that are, maybe like at most maybe 8 pages long. So shorter articles without, massive statistical complexities. I'm interested in, believe it or not, like sexy titles, right? So if it's got something cool in the title, like they might actually like open it, like, oh, open it up and read it, right? I tend to pick things, we have a lot of education majors. So I pick things that maybe have to do with childhood, or, maybe they're, a lot of them are baby, females, babysitters and working in childcare, whatever. So I'm thinking about all of these things in addition to how it fits with my lecture for that week, the topic for that week, obviously the story that I'm telling throughout the class. Like, how does this, last week we talked about this, and how can I draw on that for this? So there's all kinds of things that I'm thinking about when I'm picking articles to read. And so I said in this meeting, I said, of course, if I had several articles I couldn't decide from, I might look into the background of each of the authors to try, I could, in theory, look into the background of each of the authors to find out who is, a member of this week's oppressed group. And I really did say that. Say that. I said, but, that is certainly not my first priority. And I told them, I said, coincidentally, when I was reading this article, I was also getting essays on an article that I had assigned in this very class, in class that has to, write a response. And these supposedly enlightened students, today's enlightened students, did not know that Kate McLean was a woman. They kept writing about McLean as a man. They kept saying he. So they're revealing the typical bias, assuming that, an academic was a male. So I don't think that they care as much as they say that they care. That
Oh, of
I
course
think
not.
there is, and so I mentioned this in the meeting. Okay, I said this, and I was the first one to speak. No one spoke, and so there was, one of those, pregnant pauses where it's like uncomfortable to be in the meeting, and so I was like, well, I'll just, what the hell, I'll say what I think. People were appalled, of course, at my, my saying that not only did I not care about the race and ethnicity of the author or the gender, frankly, I also didn't think that they cared that much, and I offered my little piece of evidence, which is common. It's common for people to assume an author is male, even in this enlightened world that we currently live in. So the remainder then of the time allotted to discuss this article was people talking about exactly what you just said, not the traditional view of critical thinking and choices, pedagogical choices that would advance critical thinking in the traditional sense. But they gave examples that were not content related, little activities that they do in their class or statements that they use to make people feel welcomed. Now, I'm not saying that there's, that's nice, that's lovely, but it's not advancing knowledge in the field. If you're teaching, if these are students that are in the major who are in upper level courses, they need to be learning about the field. If one 15-minute exercise, maybe at the beginning of the class, okay, that's fine. A smattering throughout, whatever. But if you're spending most of your class period making people feel welcome, you are not teaching the content. And I don't know how much they're doing. I don't know how much that the members, the people in the meeting were, responding as expected and how much they really spend time on that. But it's exactly what you were talking about, where their description of critical thinking was that the new, the new order version.
Right.
And they were praised. They were heavily praised. So I was heavily criticized for what I said, and they were heavily praised for all of their comments.
Yeah, but and this goes back to a comment that I was making before, right? These people, I mean, how are they this stupid? The empiricist epistemology that underlines social psychology is fundamentally incompatible with another one that requires you to assume a conclusion that is, even at surface inspection, deeply, deeply, deeply dubious. Well, not just a conclusion, a whole series of conclusions,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And so they were
And
saying
yeah,
like, oh, the feedback, the students love this. Yeah, but
so what?
did they learn about personality psychology? Did they learn about clinical psychology? I don't know. Now, maybe some of them were more, pedagogically sound for the field, and they focused on only, the critical social justice aspects of them. I don't know enough about what they're doing in the classroom, but it was definitely that theme, the theme.
So, but also here's another point. If you want to teach critical social justice as an ideology, if you're an educator, you have to be, well, there are two ways of doing it. Like there are two, what I would say, ethical ways of doing it, right? One, you teach it objectively. This is what these people believe and why. And then you point the counter arguments, or you do what I do, which is a bit more fun, I think, is you try and sell the class on it. And then in the next class, you try and
Yeah.
disabuse them of it, right? So you give them two competing ideological takes. Either way, regardless of whether you believe in critical social justice or you believe in liberalism or you believe in some version of Marxism or whatever, because I remember I had a teacher in university when I was an undergrad who was a full-on Marxist. And yet he was capable of teaching Marxism, explaining why he is a Marxist, and then in the same class going on to give a seriously good version of all the major critiques against Marxism. So it's not like this can't be done. It can be
We
done.
can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right. And I mean, I've done it. That was my experience of learning ideology as an undergrad, so I know that it can be done. I've seen other people do it. You can find lots of people who do it on YouTube. But for critical social justice, it's special. You've got this epistemology that is antithetical to the foundations of social psychology, and not necessarily that the conclusions are necessarily, they might be true, but this requirement to believe that they are true, and that the analytic process is not analyzing open questions, but rather trying to find out the many and various ways that these certain conclusions happen to be correct. I mean, that's very, very dangerous. And that these people don't see that these two intellectual epistemologies, ways of looking at the world, are fundamentally incompatible is deeply alarming.
So let's design this study, the one that we read, only only they have to read an essay endorsing or criticizing critical social justice, some critical social justice thing. I don't, could be anything. So what do you think would happen? So we have, instead of an essay on global warming and what was it, parental controls. So now we have endorsing critical social justice something or other, or criticizing something or other. So we still have the white evaluators, and so we have a black person writing something, a supposedly black person writing something surprisingly against critical social justice, or a white person writing something against critical social justice.
So I can give you from my personal experience what happened with that at my last university. So when I came out against critical social justice openly, guess who were the only people? So plenty of people would support me, but it would be over the coffee break or over the photocopy machine in quiet. But the people who supported me were all the Black and Hispanic academics. All of them.
Right.
There wasn't a single one who didn't openly come down on my on my side.
So we would predict then that in a similar study, like the one that we read for today, that a white evaluator would be very critical would give low marks basically to a white person who wrote critical of social justice, higher marks to a person who wrote in support of critical social justice. What about a black writer, supposedly black writer, who was critical or who wrote in support of?
See, now here's where things get interesting, and I don't know. And would be the first,
we don't know. We know.
So we're just playing that, playing with the idea. So here's the interesting thing. On the one hand, black writers like McWhorter and Lowry seem to kind of have an impunity that somebody like you or I wouldn't do. Do you know what I mean?
Right. So a white writer might go, wow, that's, it might be very impressed. Yeah.
Right. So on the other hand, if you look at some of the vitriol that is being delivered against the likes of Thomas Sowell for being a conservative and black,
Right.
it's I really don't know.
Yeah.
I suspect the difference would be, because there is a kind of, like, in the United States, there's always been a kind of a professional kind of black race hustler, hasn't there? There's that kind of category of person. Like Jesse Jackson is kind of one of them, isn't he? I think. And
I don't.
who was the famous one in New York?
Oh, you mean?
Drawing,
Yes, I know who you're talking about.
what's the name? They call
It'll come.
themselves the
It,
Reverend something.
Reverend Al.
Al Jones.
No,
Reverend.
they always call him Reverend Al. So, yeah, but I
Race
do know
hustler.
who you're talking about.
Reverend Al Sharpton. There you go.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, obviously a very bright guy,
Yeah.
but perhaps not the most moral person in the world. Where have you gone? There you are. Perhaps not the most moral person in the world, and has been caught, you know, actually being something other than sincere on a number of occasions. But there always is somebody like that, isn't there? And there always are groups of black people like that who would organize and try and call people like Sowell or a McWhorter or Glenn Lowry and Uncle Tom and
yeah, and he's Al Sharpton is at every black person who dies, he's given the eulogy. He's on every,
yeah.
and he's got this, like when he was 14, he like declared himself a reverend. Like he's in one of those. Yeah, he really what he's in one of those evangelical churches where people just sort of like grow into this and get sort of chosen, or they choose the profession or whatever. So he's not actually like an educated. I mean, there are people who obviously are highly educated, religious studies, theologians and everything, and he's not one.
He's not one of
but
them.
he is black, so
right,
he is
that
black.
counts for something. So no, I suspect. But what I want to do is I want to draw a sharp differentiation between black people and those organized groups. So I suspect a black person might get more vitriol from those organized groups than a white person would. Be accused of being a race traitor and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, on the other hand, black people in general, which is a completely different thing, might have a completely different reaction. I suspect would have a completely different reaction.
Yeah. And so perhaps because this particular study, this was individual writer feedback, then it may not, it may not matter because it's not not a group, it's an individual. And perhaps in an educational setting, someone wouldn't be, rated lower because they had given, I don't know. But I would like to see I would like to see a 2020, 2025, maybe they're doing it now, a redo of this in the current, I just think that, this article's only 5 years old, and I just feel that the educational environment right now is so different than it was then.
Yes, I mean, back in 2011, 2012, I saw this coming, right? It was all, the building blocks, the foundation had already been laid for this, and it was pretty strong because people were regarding critical thinking in education as critical theory even back then. But now the people who were qualifying, I mean, they're probably the people who are qualifying 5 years before me. But certainly in my age group, the people who are qualifying are now in the system, right? And they are kind of enforcing this. And so one of the reasons why I think that educational standards are falling is because teachers, and they actually say this as well, by the way, teachers I can give you loads of examples within the academic literature of people saying that my primary role is not as an educator in the traditional sense, but as a transformative intellectual, as a term that's
Right.
often used, right? So they don't see their primary role as teaching maths or English or science. That's secondary. It may even be a quite distant secondary, because their primary goal is this kind of messianic, I'm going to make people aware of the structures of power and how unjust they
Right.
are, so that we can all focus on the main task, which means to transform society to make it a more just place. And so because they're focusing so much on that, the other stuff is dropping off by the wayside. And I think that would, again, I don't have the evidence to back this up, but I would be surprised if that wasn't a major factor
Well, we're
in
seeing, yeah, we are definitely seeing it. And so whatever the reason behind it, whether it is,
well, the
the
reasons, right?
oh yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Whatever the reasons, yes. We definitely are seeing this play out. And right now, at universities like mine, I don't think it, to go back to what you'd said earlier, at the highest levels of education, the more prestigious universities, I don't think that they're seeing as many problems. I think they're probably doing more, as much, as of the same kinds of things. But I do think the students are already, they're still getting a really good pool of great students, motivated students. Because I do think that there is still a, a body of those students. But at places like where I am, there are fewer and fewer, and they're going, they're getting accepted to those colleges in higher numbers now. It used to be at a place like where I am, we would get some really awesome students that just didn't make the cut right around the corner here in the Boston area,
Mm-hmm.
and I am a firm believer that you can get a good education anywhere. You might have to work harder to get it. You might have to dig a little around to get it, but you can get one,
Get one on
and
your
so
phone.
yeah,
You
exactly.
can, you
They
can.
were, yeah, they were getting, a really great education at my institution. Um, and we're going on to great jobs and, prestigious graduate schools and everything. And I'm not sure that that's even possible now. Um, I just don't think that we have the enrollment cliff, we have all this ideology, we have all this, as exactly what's in this article, where we have the tyranny of low expectations that is now permeating at all levels, not just in certain pockets. It's, very ubiquitous. And I think that, that we're not getting they're not
It's not
getting as much out of it.
it's not helping anybody. It's making people
Right.
believe things about reality that aren't true, which will then go on to a whole, if you believe lots of things about reality that aren't true, um, it almost doesn't matter what they are.
Right.
They're all going to lead
Right.
to lots and lots of negative consequences.
Yeah.
So we're making people believe lots of things about reality that aren't true in a education system that now has two epistemologies, one which it claims is primary that has actually become secondary, and which is incompatible with this kind of empiricist way of looking at the world, which is completely incompatible with the kind of critical theory that is dominating it. That, it's not critical thinking in the weak sense and strong sense, as if they are two kind of alternate ways of looking at the world. They are completely incompatible. And this is having negative consequences for absolutely everybody, especially Black people, who won't get the feedback that they need to go on, or are less likely to get the feedback they need to go on and do well, because they've been equipped with an education that helps them engage with reality.
Yeah.
The whole of the institution of academia has been subverted by delusion. I don't know. It certainly seems to be delusion, delusional nonsense. which is very, 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 very sad. And that's not to say that there aren't still some people getting really great educations, or that there aren't great educators out there. Of course there are. I know many of them. But I think those great educators, the ones that I know, would probably agree with everything we just said.
Especially in private.
Especially in private.
Yeah.
And again, anecdotally, the Hispanic and African American ones have tended to be more actually open about that. And it was nice when people tried to cancel me, that they all rallied around me, which was great. Good. And on that note, thank you very much.